symposium. I've learned a lot today from getting the various perspectives of the speakers. And so I'll share some data here from a collaborative project that was mostly carried out by a couple of members of my lab, Carlos Tenesaka and Nate Lawrence, and in collaboration with Matt Helmers and Bill Crumpton, who's another faculty member here at Iowa State. And so many of you are familiar with driving around the southern prairie pothole region in the early to midsummer and seeing scenes like this, right? Really sad fields of corn and soybeans, right? Where we see periodic ponding in former pothole wetlands, right? That despite our best efforts perhaps at drainage, we'll continue to pond, and these are really widely known to be a source of yield suppression at the regional scale. And I think what's received a little less attention, perhaps, is the potential environmental impacts of these poorly drained, farmed depressions in our region. And I think this is a really key issue because of the enormous landscape extent that these depressions comprise. So, according to some recent work out of Bill Crumpton's group, these make up almost 10% of the land area in the Des Moines lobe. So this figure here showing their spatial distribution, and on average, right, these are often small features, smaller than a hectare. They can be as large as several hundred hectares. As we know, the vast majority of these former pothole wetlands have been drained to some extent by subsurface tile and in some cases surface inlets. But yet, despite our best efforts, many of these depressions still exhibit sort of flashy hydroperiods. They're not traditional wetlands, but they're not well-drained upland environments either. And these are some nice data from Amy Kalita's group at Iowa State, basically showing the patterns of inundation of several depressions over time. And so the x-axis is time and y-axis is depth of ponding. And what you'll notice in these different colored lines is that these different depressional features will pond water to differing degrees, but they will all pond over time periods of hours to days to even weeks in some cases, even during what we would consider normal rainfall years. And up until now, right, we've really focused largely, I think, as a field on the impact of these flooded depressions on crop yield. But I think really the impacts on the environmental impacts deserve further study. And so if we want to assess how nitrate and phosphate leaching might vary between better drained upland environments and crop depressions that have been tile drained to some extent, we might expect from first principles some differences about leaching fluxes, right? We may expect from first principles, well, we have more restricted infiltration in the depressions, higher clay content, differing hydrologic characteristics of these soils, right, that make them pond water in the first place. And we might also expect that during these periods of ponded conditions, we might get substantial removal of nitrate via denitrification. So on balance, we might expect lower leaching of nitrate and phosphate in tile drain depressions than uplands. But we might, from the other side of the coin, we might expect several mechanisms that could actually enhance leaching of nitrate and phosphate through the soil profile, right? These depressional systems have a small surrounding catchment that's providing them subsidies of water and nutrients, right, from shallow subsurface flow and surface flow. Again, when we're killing off the crop in the depressions, we're removing that biological sink for nutrients, right? And finally, in many cases, the depressional soils have substantially greater soil organic matter content, right, providing potential for greater nutrient release during decomposition, right? And so the objective of this work is really to evaluate these competing mechanisms and test this hypothesis that these crop depressions that are tile drained may actually leach more nitrate and phosphate than adjacent upland soils. If we assume that greater nutrient availability in these landscape features outweighs these potential hydrological and biological constraints on nutrient leaching losses. And so the approach we used here, these are some measurements we've done over the last few years and continuing on in various facets. We've established monitoring transects that span the bottom of depressions and then stretching into adjacent upland, better drained environments across a wide variety of different depressions, different land use types. both in central Iowa near Iowa State University, as well as some sites in northwest Iowa. And again, as you can see in this picture, right, a really sort of a stark visual illustration of what we're talking about here with intermittent ponding. In many cases, we're mostly, if not entirely, killing off the crop in these depressions, right? We can see, this was taken in late June, I believe, of 2018. This was planted to soybeans. All of the beans are dead, right? We've got the beans that are doing pretty well outside of the depression, and we've begun to see some annual weeds crop up. But again, mostly bare soil. This is relatively representative of these features in our region. And so one approach we used here to quantify leaching of nitrate and phosphate is to use resin lysimeters. Essentially, these are ion exchange resins packed in PVC pipes that are open to flow. And we install these low undisturbed soil profiles. Essentially, we auger in at a 45-degree angle, and we install these by hand under intact soil. We refill the hole, and we leave them deployed for typically a year to record the leaching fluxes of these nutrients. And so we install these just below the dominant rooting zone in our systems, 35 centimeters. This allows us to install these by hand and avoid having to bring a backhoe out to the site and really cause a lot more disturbance of the soil system. It keeps them above sort of the perennial water table, but also below the dominant zone of denitrification, which we've quantified in previous work. And this approach allows us to get relatively high spatial replication. We can throw out hundreds of these lysimeters onto the landscape. And again, sort of an illustration of the approach we've used. The depressions are outlined here in black, and then our sampling transects here with the sampling locations are in red, and these are spanning gradients of about 100 meters on average from the bottom of depressions to sort of adjacent topographic maxima in the landscape. And this is just one of the sites we've worked at. These sites are sort of under what we would think as conventional management for the region in terms of corn and bean rotations, traditional tillage, traditional sort of N rates that you might expect across the landscape. Some of the depressions we've monitored have surface inlets. All have tiling to some extent with varying intensity. And so just to jump right into our results. And so this figure shows essentially the nitrate leaching fluxes if we divide all our samples into what we call upland versus depression categories. And you can see there's tremendous variability in the nitrate leaching that we measure at a given location, right? This is really consistent with what we know about the heterogeneity in soil flow paths and soil processes, right? But on average, we find that the depressions actually have slightly greater nitrate leaching fluxes than uplands, a little over 100 kilograms of N per hectare. This is slightly statistically significant, and you might say, "Wow, these are pretty high nitrate yields." They are, but they're plausible in the context of nearby measurements that are made at the catchment scale by Bill Crumpton and Matt Helmers. And if we account for the area of those catchments that are actually cropped, these actually match pretty well with the sort of the end of the drainage pipe measurements that they are making. And we can dive into these data at greater detail and look at how nitrate leaching varies across sort of individual topographic gradients at individual elevations. So here's one example. So here a relative elevation of 0 is the bottom of the depression, and then we're moving upslope here up 4 meters, which is sort of a mountain, right, for central Iowa. And we can see, a fairly predictable trend in nitrate across this gradient. It's worth noting that the different depressions that we've monitored tend to behave fairly differently. In some cases, we see these consistent increases from top to bottom, and in others we don't. And sort of the underlying mechanisms driving this variation are still unclear. We have a lot more data in the pipeline that's been slowed due to COVID, but at this point we've got a couple more site years under cover crops and conventional management and other perennial vegetation types. So we're excited to dive in a little more to the mechanisms in subsequent work. So shifting gears to phosphorus. We saw an even clearer signal here in terms of topography, in terms of phosphate leaching. On average, in the depressions, the soluble reactive phosphorus we're able to extract from these resins, the flux is about double in the depressions as it is in the uplands, and really highly statistically significant. And again, we can look across multiple gradients in different sort of depression to upland transects. And again, in some cases, we see consistent increases as we're moving down slope. In other cases, not so much. But again, we never sort of see greater phosphate leaching in uplands than we do in depressions. Okay, so coming back to sort of this conceptual model that I gave you a few slides ago, right? We might expect, some mechanisms to be driving these patterns and leaching from first principles, right? So what is the role of differences in water infiltration fluxes in actually driving these patterns? Do we actually see lower overall infiltration of water in depressions than we do in uplands, right? Especially in cases where surface inlets or ET might be broader or more important contributions to the water budget. And so one sort of preliminary method we use to get at this is to use sodium as a semi-conservative tracer of water flux across these sites, right? We would ideally use chloride. Unfortunately, we can't measure that because we extract our resins in potassium chloride, but we've got sodium, which is not a limiting plant nutrient, and it associates only weakly with cation exchange sites. And fortunately for us, the major sources of sodium to agricultural landscapes are relatively homogeneous. So under the assumption, right, that sodium is telling us something about the overall water flux, we see that there are actually relatively similar rates of sodium leaching on average between depressions and uplands. And this is sort of consistent with some other modeling work that's been done, that despite sort of differences in drainage characteristics in depressions versus uplands, the subsidy of water from upslope helps to counteract sort of the lower hydraulic conductivity of these soils, and also the fact that some water is often lost to surface inlets. So next, we were really curious about the role of denitrification in particular in affecting sort of the trends in nitrate leaching across these transects. And sort of one way to get at this is an approach adopted by my grad student, Nate Lawrence, who installed some zero tension lysimeters across one of these topographic transects and monitored these really at close intervals during a couple of years. Essentially, these zero tension lysimeters capture the infiltrating volume, route it to a bottle that we're able to then pump up and actually measure the nitrate concentrations in these samples. And what Nate did is to measure the stable isotope composition of that nitrate in the infiltration. And this is useful because it can give us a handle as to the sort of relative extent of denitrification and how that might be influencing individual water samples at different times and different places, right? So the enzymes of denitrifiers tend to fractionate against these heavy isotopes of nitrate, the N15 and N018. And so what Nate found here, again, we're looking at one of these topographic gradients where 0 is the bottom of the depression and 2.25 meters is up on the top. He sees a fair amount of variability in N15 values. And if you're not familiar with isotopes, don't worry about the details. One way we can interpret these is with respect to the sources of reactive nitrogen in the system. So fertilizer and soil organic matter, which essentially fall within this box here. And any increase in those values may be due in part to fractionation by denitrifiers. And we do see that there is enrichment in the N15 of the residual nitrate in these systems, but it's highly variable. And there's essentially times of year where there's very little difference between source N15 and the N15 that we find in the lysimeters, really suggesting that denitrification is variably efficient over time in these landscapes, particularly during periods of peak infiltration. So we can go back to this model and overall, right, denitrification is not enough to really attenuate this increase in nitrate inputs to these depressional soils. So what about the other side of the coin, right? Do we have evidence for actual increases in nutrient availability in depressions versus uplands? So to get at this, we did some relatively comprehensive soil sampling at peak, sort of peak growing season in 2018 across a number of these gradients that I showed you earlier, and just extracting soils to measure ammonium and nitrate and the mineralization potential of those soils, right? How much ammonium and nitrate can they release by microbial processes? And what we found, again, looking across these topographic gradients, these different colors and symbols are different sites and depths, we find that on average, there's much greater standing concentrations of ammonium and nitrate in depressions relative to uplands. There's also slightly but significantly greater nitrogen mineralization potential in these depressional soils. So, right, really, driving home this idea that from first principles, there's greater availability of mineral N to be leached in these positions, irrespective of differences in hydrology and actually moving them through the soil profile. So I think that really, supports this conceptual framework that depressions can be hotspots of leaching of nitrate and phosphate, right? Even considering these interactions of different physical and biological factors. So on average, right, the take-home points, we see substantial amount of heterogeneity among the depressions that we've monitored, but on average, these tend to have greater leaching of nitrate and especially soluble phosphorus when we compare them with adjacent upland environments. The drivers appear to be increased availability of nutrient with similar overall infiltration fluxes of water. And I think these suggest a couple of points that merit further attention, right? It seems like the low-hanging fruit would simply be variable rate nutrient application in these landscapes, right? Simply back off on the N and P rates to depressions, right? They're naturally much more fertile, and these inputs are much more susceptible to losses. And it also suggests that, in many of these places, despite the fact the existing drainage infrastructure, we might actually benefit by enhancing this, right? To improve nutrient use efficiency of the crop. When the crop is consistently dying during most years, we have very low, if not zero, nutrient use efficiency. So I'd like to acknowledge several funders that have contributed to this, the Iowa Nutrient Research Center, the EPA through a wetland development grant, USDA. And this is really just a small part of a broader collaborative project at ISU with a number of other faculty that are exploring sort of different management interventions in these systems, including changes in vegetation type, establishing perennials, cover crops, et cetera. And our group has done a lot more work beyond nutrient leaching to focus on trace gas emissions, soil carbon, et cetera. And happy to touch on that or any of these other points if there's time for questions. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Stephen. And I think, again, feel free to post your questions in the chat, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the session here. But we'll move on to our next speaker. And it's my privilege and honor to introduce Eileen Kladivko, Professor of Agronomy at Purdue University. And again, it's through this highly collaborative network of land grant schools and working in drainage over the years that I've had the opportunity to get to know Eileen and work a bit together. And I could probably say that on behalf of many of my other colleagues as well. Eileen does research and teaching in soil physics, soil biology, and soil management. And she's been active in the cover crops work as well over the years, and is a founding member of the Midwest Cover Crops Council. So Eileen, it's a real pleasure to have you here today. Thanks for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Gary. You can hear me okay and see my slide? Okay, good to go. Great. Thanks very much. So I'm going to talk about a 35-year project in less than 20 minutes. So I'm just going to go. Looking at drainage for the long haul and impacts on crop yields and soil health from a long-term project that we have in southeastern Indiana. And of course, everybody that's on this symposium here knows that naturally poorly drained soils give us a lot of challenges for crop production. And so one of the techniques that we use is tile drainage, and it's a very common practice. It is often seasonal in function, which sometimes we don't think about, we kind of forget about, but that's also very important from the nutrient standpoint. But I won't be talking about that part today. So I am going to be giving you some snippets of information from our long-term CPAC, Southeast Purdue Agricultural Center Drainage Research Project down here in southeastern Indiana. The original goals of this project from right about the time I got to Purdue, 1982, 83, were not just drainage, but it was basically looking at on this poorly structured, low organic matter soil, naturally poorly drained, Claremont silt loam soil, yes, to improve drainage. That was a part of the state that had not traditionally been tile drained because of the high silt content, but with the advent of modern perforated plastic drain tube in the 70s, the farmers in that part of the state asked Purdue to do some research on it. And I arrived at Purdue about the time that a project was beginning. So that they wanted us to see about improving drainage, but also about improving soil physical properties. Again, that's a very low organic matter soil. It had a lot of crusting and erosion problems. Water didn't infiltrate into the soil very well. That was another reason they didn't think drainage would work. Was the soil even permeable enough that tile drains would be of any benefit? And of course, to see whether tile drainage would improve crop growth and yield. In the interim, we've added a lot of water quality studies, but I'm not going to talk about those today. The CPAC drainage research site was begun by looking at drainage installed at 4 different spacings. My 3 senior colleagues, all in their mid-50s, and I was barely 30, they were experienced people in soils and drainage, and they wanted to look at what the optimum drain spacing would be. So the drain spacings were installed at 5, 10, 20, and 40 meters, or 16, 33, 66, and 132 feet. The 3 of them assured me that this soil was so slowly permeable that these widest spacings would in essence be like an undrained control because the soil was so slowly permeable. And that's pretty close to reality. The drains were installed at 2.5 to 3 foot depth. So please note that our drains in Indiana a lot of times are shallower than they are in Iowa and Minnesota. 2.5 to 3 foot typical depth, typical 4-inch plastic drain tube, and no sock or filter. The drains were installed in February and March of 1983. We had unusually warm, dry weather. So the main drain was established here parallel to the state highway with the typical laser guided equipment of the time. Our laterals went up into the field, but before they exited into the main, we had them exit into a culvert here where we could monitor water flow and sample for water quality. And then from there, the water was routed out to the main drain to the ditch. So to kind of summarize, drainage pays, which I'm sure everybody that's attending this symposium is happy to hear and has never heard before. But let's just reiterate, drainage pays. Drainage improved the timeliness of the field work. During the first 10 years of our experiment, different drain spacings were chiseled and planted when the soil was ready. So we were doing chisel tillage in the spring. That was the standard practice for that particular soil. And each spacing was done when it was ready. So the farm superintendent, along with myself, we would look at the soil and decide, okay, this one is ready for tillage. So we tilled it today and planted it tomorrow. The next day, maybe the 10-meter one was now ready for tillage and then planting. And then, of course, you know what happened in some years. In some years, the undrained control, it would rain in between, right? So we got a couple of plots planted and then it would rain and it would be set back to ground zero. So over that first 10 years, the undrained control plots were delayed between 1 and 15 days, depending on the year, compared to that narrowest drain spacing. And so obviously, you know that more timely access to the field is a major benefit to most farming operations. And during that first 10 years, we had a couple of years where that timely access was on the order of 2 weeks difference, which can be huge for a farming operation. This image illustrates that drainage did in fact work on that soil, which was the initial question. Looking at this aerial image here, and then the drain lines have been drawn on top of them. You could see the lighter colored soil here where we had all of our intense drainage system. So the soil was in fact draining and drying out faster. And you can see the dark colored soil not drained for our undrained controls. So the first question, would these drains even work, was answered very positively. Yes, they do work. Let's take a look at the yields, and I'm going to show the first 10 years where we did do the timeliness differences, and then I'm going to show some of the newer data. So the 10-year average over here on the right for our spacings, the dark blue is our 5-meter spacing, and then 10, 20, and then the light blue is that undrained control. So the 10-year average was 10 bushel per acre difference between the undrained control and the narrowest drain spacing, which frankly was less than what we were anticipating. There's several reasons for that. The first one being that we didn't have that many real wet years, but we did have a 10 bushel average difference. But you can obviously see that those yields varied every year. In some years, the narrowest drain spacing was the highest yield, and then subsequent drain spacings went lower, with the undrained control being the least. Some years, the intermediate spacings had the highest yield. In 7 of the 10 years, this light blue bar here, the undrained control, was the lowest yielding. Okay, so it was pretty consistent that no drainage yielded less than everything else. Okay, that's the first 10 years. Another thing, of course, that farmers are interested in with drainage is maturity of the crop and moisture at the time of harvest. So this is the grain moisture content averaged over the 10 years. And there was a 2-point difference between the narrowest spacing and the undrained control. So our narrowest spacing was right around 21% grain moisture at harvest. Our undrained control right around 23%. We did harvest all the plots on the same day. We didn't wait longer. So that obviously would be a benefit to the farmer because then you have less grain drying costs. Let's look at some of the more recent corn data. So these are the corn yields. After the first 10 years, we did switch to a corn soybean rotation, and we did switch to no-till. So during this last 10-year period here, we still had some years like 2007 and 2011 where the yields were not that drastically different among the spacings, and the undrained control was a little bit less, but not a whole lot. But all the other years here, you can see huge differences. This undrained control is much, much lower in yield, this light blue bar on the right, much lower in yield than all of the other drain spacings. 50 bushels or more yield difference in many of those years. And of course, that was because those years were a lot wetter than some of the years that we had early on in the project. So drainage pays, okay? On average, over all the corn years of that 35-year period, there were 24 corn years. The undrained control had 144 bushels per acre average. All of the drained spacings had in the 160s, and this narrowest drain spacing had 168 bushels. So 24 bushel per acre yield difference on average over that 24 years of corn. So quite a big difference, really underscoring how drainage pays on a soil like this. So soybean yields, for whatever reason, were not actually affected. If you look at this last set of bars here, from 94 to 18, all of the soybean years, there was essentially no difference, no statistical difference among the grain spacings in the soybean yields. Obviously, you could see right here in 2018, the undrained control had a much lower yield than all the other spacings. But in 2016 and in 2014, the undrained control actually had slightly greater yields. So on average, over the years that we were growing soybeans, we did not see a yield difference. What about surface drainage? So this particular field does have very good surface drainage. It's got slightly more slope. It's still less than 1%, but slightly more slope than many Claremont fields in the region. And the local farmers don't miss an opportunity to remind me of that when I'm there talking about this particular project, that they have fields that don't have quite such perfect drainage. And so the importance of subsurface drainage on our particular field, you would expect to be not quite as dramatic as on a field that does not have as good of a surface drainage. So I'm going to show you a picture of where the impact of having tiles versus no tiles on another part of the same field, which was a different experiment that we did for 10 years, had less ideal surface drainage. Now, this is not the prairie pothole region, right? So this is not a depression that you would identify as a pothole. It's just slightly ponded water at times. This part of the field in the foreground was the untiled part of that field. It was planted 3 times and drowned out 3 times in this particular year, the year after we ended the experiment on this part of the field, of course. In the background, you can see the corn stubble from a very good corn crop, and that was on the tile drained portion of that particular field. So again, obviously for farmers that have larger fields and have portions of the field that are not good surface drainage, the fact that water can pond enough and you can replant and it can happen again, and you get no yield at all, then obviously that's a much greater yield benefit than the small differences that we saw in areas where we have good surface drainage. Drainage pays in other ways too. So in later years, we have been growing cover crops every other year on that on the spacing field now. And here on the left, you can see this was on May 13th of 2016. So we were going to soybeans. It was a wet year, but we were also letting the cover crop grow longer before soybeans to get more biomass. And so on these tiled plots, we had about 3,100 pounds of cereal rye top growth biomass per acre. So good growth, good stand. On the right, you can see our undrained control. Looks pretty puny, a lot less growth, less than 1/4 as much growth as what we had in the tiled portion of the field. So again, if a person is going to plant cover crops, they're planting them for a reason, right? They want them to do something, take up nitrate or improve soil health, improve soil aggregation, something. So you want it to grow. And in this case, the cover crop grows much better where you have tile drainage than where it doesn't, where you don't. Usually when I talk about the drainage work, I focus on the drainage experiment number 1, which was the 4 drain spacings, which is what I have just done with you folks. But I want to talk just a little bit about that other experiment that we did in another portion of the field where we had a tile drained kind of subfield versus no tile drain subfield. We split the plots, chisel and no-till. And then we had 5 what we call agronomic treatments. So this is getting back to one of those original objectives, which was to improve soil physical properties or soil health. We'd probably categorize it today. We had treatments of continuous corn. So CC here is continuous corn, not cover crops. Continuous corn only. That was our control. Then we had continuous corn with a winter cover of either wheat or cereal rye. It varied from year to year. We had another plot that was continuous corn with a winter cover of annual ryegrass. Another one, continuous corn with dry manure application in the spring. And then the last one was a 3-year rotation where we had corn, wheat, and then an orchard grass red clover meadow. Cover crops at that time, we hand broadcast them into the standing corn each fall in those plots because they were 100 feet long, so relatively small plots. All right, 2 different points that I want to make with this graph. The blue bars are the tiled and the red bars are untiled. So the first one is where I have the percentages listed here. This is the percent increase for tiling compared to no tile for each of those treatments. So for continuous corn, where it was tiled, we had 12% greater yield than where it was not tiled. For all of our other agronomic practices, we were more like a 20% increase in yield compared to where it wasn't, where it was tiled compared to where it wasn't tiled. Okay, so more benefit where we had those conservation practices. The other way to look at it is to look at our control here, a continuous corn control, and where it was tiled, so the blue bars, we had equal or greater yields for our conservation practices than where equal or greater than the continuous corn where it was tiled. Where it wasn't tiled, all of those conservation practices gave equal or lower yields than where we had continuous corn. So again, making the point that if you're going to plant cover crops or you're going to do other conservation practices, you really need to have good drainage in order to make the most use of that. Earthworms, I've done some earthworm stuff on and off at this location as well as others. Earthworm populations were generally higher where we had no-till versus chisel at this experiment as well as other fields and experiments that we've worked on. Earthworm populations were generally higher where it was tiled versus where it was not tiled because it was simply too wet for the earthworms to do as well on the untiled. Earthworm populations were generally high where we fed them more with cover crops or rotation or manure versus the control. Soil physical properties we measured at various times during that initial 10-year period on that other experiment, and they tended to be improved also by cover crops and rotation. And we primarily measured aggregate stability and infiltration. So the bottom line from that is that drainage pays by enabling other conservation practices to work better than where you don't have adequate drainage. So if you have a naturally poorly drained soil and you're using conservation practices such as no-till or cover crops or rotations with hay crops, they're often more effective in both improving crop yields as well as improving soil physical properties and soil health in general in the tiled versus the untiled system. So when I'm talking with groups, I like to stress that adequate drainage is a necessary first step before we can improve crop yields and soil health by doing other conservation practices. Those other conservation practices by themselves will not be very effective if you don't have adequate drainage. So to summarize, long-term investment, tile drainage, drain flow does develop with time. That's a whole nother talk, but it does take some time for drainage flow paths to develop after installation. The yield effects, of course, are going to vary from year to year. Some years, drainage isn't going to make much difference. Other years, it's going to make a huge difference, maybe the difference between a crop and no crop. Conservation practices themselves also take time to improve soil health. So you're going to get this synergy building as the drain flow paths develop and as your conservation practices mature. But the long-term improvement in the cash crop yields and your cover crop growth and the effectiveness of those other practices do make tile drains a good investment. So my last slide, if you'd like more details on anything that I talked about and the things that I didn't talk about, I have some recorded videos, parts 1, 2, and 3, the first on yields and timeliness, the next on cover crops, and the one I didn't talk about today at all, drain flow and nitrate loads. If you prefer to read, I have those as extension publications. These are all new as of June this year. So you can check out my drainage website or the Purdue Education store for details about any of those. And I think I'm just right about on time, Gary. So thank you very much.
That's perfect. So we're going to transition. I'm going to introduce our next speaker. And again, feel free to put those comments or questions in the comment, and then we will get to those when we finish this round of speakers. So next up, I'm excited to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Allison Eagle with the Environmental Defense Fund. Dr. Eagle provides technical expertise to move efforts to eliminate nutrient pollution from productive agriculture from theory and research farms to really application in environmental markets and supply chain sustainability commitments. So, and she'll be presenting on Nutrinet and impacts of 4R and the kind of really innovative, impactful coordinated site network that Nutrinet is. So with that, I will turn it over to Allison.
Okay, thank you, John. Thank you, everybody, for the opportunity to speak with you today. This is going to be a little bit different because I don't do field research, but I collaborate with other people who are doing field research and trying to bring those data and that information to application in how we guide policy, and which is not just government policy, but projects in the supply chain space, as well as in other areas, in attempts to deal with nutrient losses and reduce those losses from the farm. So I have a soil science background and grew up on a farm in Alberta. So even though I work for an environmental organization, I still consider myself an agronomist, soil scientist, agriculturalist, and hopefully we can all figure out how to work together. I'm based in EDF's North Carolina office, but along with the rest of our Working Lands team, my work focuses on production agriculture across the country. And for this research work, I'd like to acknowledge collaborators at universities and government research facilities, and especially in this case, Laurie Avendroth at Iowa State University and Ty Maz at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, who've been involved lately in the data and synthesis work for this project. It looks like I need to click. There we go. We use fertilizer of different kinds, including synthetic sources as well as manure, to sustain our high crop productivity. And so farmers and the rest of society want to see more of that fertilizer go into the crop, the right-hand side of this into the food supply chain, and less of it going into the environment. Different scientists and practitioners, however, focus on different parts of this system. And we have, for example, agronomists and farmers that look at ways to improve yield and get fertilizer into the crop plants. And then other people are concerned about losses to the air, so the atmospheric science, or soil scientists are thinking about what's happening with those nutrients in the soil and the land. And then we have hydrologists and agricultural engineers that are thinking about the nutrients going into the water. And so often there are some significant walls between these different groups. So they don't always see how what they are doing affects the other parts of the system. And I think meetings like this are one way to bring people together. But we might find that pushing on a lever to increase yield, for example, might cause environmental challenges, or doing something that's intended to reduce nitrate losses in the water could inadvertently increase nitrous oxide emissions. So the atmospheric people are thinking about that. So in order to actually bring these walls down, break down these walls, or maybe even change them into bridges, this is the type of work that we're doing in collaboration between different typical silos in academia, but also between academia and practitioners, and extension people certainly think about this a lot. But how can we have agronomists speaking with the people dealing with the air quality, the greenhouse gases, the soil science, and hydrology? And we may also need to bring in other actors like economics and policy. With this type of system in mind, the 4R Research Fund supported 5 different teams of research in 2014 and 2015 to sort through the existing research and identify the impacts of 4R nutrient management on production and on environmental outcomes. So these teams wrote about these challenges. These teams worked on a number of different aspects of management and found some impact of management, weather and soil on crop yield, on nitrate leaching, on nitrous oxide emissions, and phosphorus losses. However, when we started doing this work, we struggled with the data that were published because many of the studies that reported nitrate leaching, for example, were missing yield or missing nitrogen rate data. And so or they were reporting only one aspect of it, and like they'd be reporting phosphorus losses, but not talking about nitrogen at all, and reporting nitrate leaching and not talking about nitrous oxide emissions. So we wrote about these challenges in this paper on that was published in the Agronomy Journal in 2017, and encouraged researchers to standardize the data collection and reporting and fill in some of these gaps and build some of these bridges that are needed between the different silos of study. And so looking at these different gaps, oh, here's some more of the gaps. Sorry, I didn't realize these were also coming in. So we had a lot of times people would have an impact of a certain practice, but we didn't know what other practices were going on. And so you can't compare one study to another. And in many cases, the methods or the units were highly variable, or they weren't stated, and we would have people reporting yield at standard moisture content and others that reported dry yield, and then sometimes they didn't say what they had reported. And so trying to compare across different research studies across even within a certain region was difficult. So as an example of the data gaps, this was one of the meta-analyses that was published was the work that we did on trying to find all the observations of nitrate losses in water and nitrous oxide emissions from, to the air. And we plotted these on a map of, and finding the ones that were all, this was all in corn. And the areas in the map that are green are where corn is grown in the United States. And you can see, if you look at the blue dots, that's where the nitrate observations were measured. And the reddish dots are where people measured nitrous oxide emissions. In many cases, they didn't overlap, so we don't have nitrate losses and nitrous oxide losses from the same projects, and actually from the same locations. And actually we have only one place, and that's in Minnesota, where they actually measured both nitrate and nitrous oxide at the same time. And so we don't know when management could affect one in a good way and the other in not so good of a way. So that's where this newer project started in 2017 called the Nutrinet project, where we coordinated across 8 different sites to look at multiple outcomes, both the production outcomes and the environmental outcomes, as well as soil health, and really consider the systematic data collection and try to be able to quantify some of these trade-offs and synergies between outcomes. So 6 of the 8 sites had some historical data before 2017, and the other 2 were new drainage sites. Most of them, we also set up other measures of nitrous oxide and ammonia losses as well. Here are the locations across the Corn Belt, starting in Minnesota, making a nice little curve down, and the final of the 8 sites is just across the border in Ontario. And these different sites were measuring, doing different practices to compare improved management to a farmer normal. In some cases, they were testing some different tillage treatments, different crop rotations, cover crops where the green stars are, and all of them were comparing different types of 4R management, where we have S being the source, T being the timing, and P the placement, and R being the rate. So all of these different sites were measuring a number of different things, and as a result, then the next work for the data team was to work with the field researchers to ensure that were able to compare between sites. So across all these different sites, everyone was measuring agronomic outcomes of yield for the corn and soy crops, and everyone's measuring soil health measures as well. And then these are the loss measures of nitrate and phosphorus and potassium in the water. And so that's what these 3 color things are here. 3 different sites are measuring ammonia volatilization losses, and then 6 of the 7, I guess, were measuring nitrous oxide emissions as well. So just to try to show you all the different things that were being measured at these different sites. So we now have 2 years of data complete from 2018 and 2019, and the 2020 data are in process of being collected and put together. So as a team, we've been meeting regularly and setting up, started off at the very beginning, establishing different research protocols and site mapping and a data dictionary so that when someone enters information, the crop yield has the same, we know that it means corn yield, and we know that it is at standard moisture content, and we know what units it's reported in. We know, and we make sure that everybody's reporting and at least identifying whether they're reporting their nitrogen rate in pounds of nitrogen per acre or kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, rather than just some random number that we have to guess which one it is, because that does make a difference in the end as we start to look at things. So the data dictionary was extremely valuable, as well as the research protocols that helped us deal with issues where we had, for example, some states will have standard soil sample depths of 5 inches and others will have it at 6 inches. And so we established what those protocols would be for this project. And then the data collection, we identified how we were going to do that, and we established a Google Drive with data collection forms that took a little bit of time to figure out, but after the first year, everyone said that these Google Sheets and the way to upload the data was much more convenient and easy to do, and everyone knew what they were supposed to put in. And these data are then still available, of course, for all of the primary data sites, but we then have the ability to synthesize and get information across sites out there and figure it out far more nimbly than we would otherwise. And then the Iowa State data team is doing a significant effort of data cleaning, quality control, and so we can look at different results from different sites and identify when something might look a little bit off. And so we end up with much better quality data in the end, because they've been able to go back to the field research teams and say, hey, was this nitrogen content in your corn really that number, or did somebody maybe make a calculation error? And in some cases, we've been able to identify errors and correct those and end up with higher quality data that can be used to give better information. And so then all these data are then available to be exported from all the different sites and used in synthesis. Just a few quick results. The 4R management, we put all the different treatments into 3 different groups of farmer normal in the red, 4R being 1 improved practice, 4R advanced being more than 1 improved practice. They differed across sites, and we do have other analysis that actually compares specific practices, but this is just within those groups. And overall, the corn yield was not affected by placement in these different groups, even though in 2018 we see increased corn yield in the 4R advanced, but in 2019 we saw a reduction in yield in the 4R advanced. So overall, in the 2 years, there was no impact. We'll see what 2020 shows us. We also found no impact of the improved practice on soybean yield. And the more interesting thing was that with no impact on yield, we do see a significant reduction in nitrate losses. If you look at this one on the far right, we see the farmer normal in the red and a gradual reduction in nitrate losses as we implement improved practices of improving our timing or sources of placement. And the 4R advanced, on average, reduced the nitrate losses by 5 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And soybean versus corn had a little bit lower losses as well than corn. And these yellow ones are the 0 nitrogen plots at these different sites. So this is like the background level of losses that are happening without any nitrogen fertilizer application. So that's just to show that it's not going to be easy to bring it to absolute 0, that there are just background losses of nitrate from these cropping systems. So the other thing that was interesting, I mean, we've measured nitrous oxide and nitrate, and I have 4 sites here to show examples of how these two different losses relate to each other. And now we know that when nitrous oxide is lost, we also blow off a fair amount of nitrogen as N2 gas. So the total nitrogen losses will be higher than this, but this one site lost on average around 40 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And so that's a significant amount of nitrogen that we would prefer the majority of that going to the crop than being lost to the water or to the air. And then we see, so the lighter color is the nitrate losses, with the darker color being the nitrous oxide losses. And you can see that in some cases we have far more nitrate than nitrous oxide being lost, like at the subsurf location. And in other cases, we end up with a lot with, the nitrous oxide ends up approaching the same amount per acre of total pounds of nitrogen being lost. So the average ratio for these different sites, we definitely do have more nitrogen lost as nitrate, but in some cases it's very, the ratio differs a lot by site. And within each of these sites, the different years differed a little bit too, but this trend across sites suggests that there's something about the soil types or the drainage system or something else in the cropping system that really makes different fields behave differently in terms of which nitrogen loss is going to be the biggest one to pay attention to. So if we think about managing nutrients as a system, in these experiments, some of the discussions that we've had as a research team is that we think about nitrogen losses really do happen via different pathways. And if we can measure the multiple outcomes, we can identify which of those pathways might actually be the one that's the most significant for a given field or for a different region or for a different climate, weather situation. The other thing that the researchers have talked about is that when we've implemented or improved for our practices, in most cases, they haven't been adjusting the rate at all. And if these improved practices are allowing meaning that we're reducing our losses, then perhaps we can reduce some of the rates and play with the rates a little bit more in order to fine tune that and thus possibly reduce losses even further. So those are a couple things that they're considering in the experiments. And in summary, I would say that we really need quality data and we need the data to be available from different processes and standardized data. We also need useful metrics. For example, nitrogen balance being having a relationship to nitrogen losses, where we look at nitrogen in minus nitrogen out in the harvest. And we also need, as we know, innovative managers who can then take this information and figure out which of the practices and ideas will work for their farm and end up having better production systems that are good for the farm and good for our future, having good environmental outcomes. So this was just another paper that we recently published that talks about the relationship between nitrous oxide emissions and nitrogen balance. And here are the collaborators across different universities and other groups. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Allison. I always wait for that applause, but we don't quite get that in this setting. I see you now. Thank you, Allison. Again, we'll move on to our last presentation and then reserve some time at the end for questions for our afternoon speakers. But thank you again. One of the great privileges of being involved with this event over the years is having the opportunity to have our graduate students and researchers on our teams present to this audience. This is a much different audience than they typically see at a national conference or on campus. And so it's really helped, I think it's really helped, our students really get a good appreciation for some of the needs out there. So our last presentation here is one of my students, Mike Talbot, who finished up his master's degree. Mike has been a water resources engineer with Emmons and Olivier Resources Incorporated, St. Paul consulting firm. he's been there for a number of years, but while he's been working full-time as a consulting engineer, he's been finishing up his master's. And so he got going on the topic of looking at ET, evapotranspiration estimation methods, and looking at some of the differences of those. And that interest then took him towards looking at how the choice of ET estimates influence our modeling activities, and in particular drain mod. And that's what he's going to be presenting today, some of the work from his master's research. So happy to have you, Mike. And I'll turn it over to you. Take it away.
Thanks, Gary. Hello, everyone. Hopefully everyone's still awake and here. This has to be a record attendance by almost an order of magnitude. Interesting to know how many people are still engaging here at the end of the day. So this is the 12th and final presentation of the day. And as you can see, today is December 1st, which means it's the beginning of the 12th and final month of 2020, which I don't know about you, but puts a little bit of a spring in my step. So as Gary mentioned, I am a water resources engineer at Edmonton Olivier Resources, where I've been for just over 7 years. But today we're going to look at the research I completed about a year ago as part of my master's work under Gary Sands here. Dr. Gary Sands was my advisor. And we looked at the impact that evapotranspiration model choice had on drain mod model results. So first, I want to mention that due to obvious time constraints, I'll be glossing over some things that you might be interested in. So I've made it really easy for you to find my thesis if you want to look it up and check out anything that I didn't have time to go into detail about. So I'm going to assume that most of you know a little something about evapotranspiration. Needless to say, it's an extremely important component of the water balance, and in Minnesota at least can range between 40% and 90% of annual precipitation, depending on which part of the state you're in. In agricultural settings, it also represents, nearly all of the consumptive use of water. And in flat, drained agricultural settings, where there may be little, if any, surface runoff or groundwater percolation, ET is one of the few remaining components of the water balance besides precipitation and drainage. So all this is to say that for any kind of drainage modeling exercise, it's crucial to make an earnest attempt to accurately estimate ET rates. So while ET may be extremely important for modeling purposes, it's unfortunately one of the most difficult components of the water balance to measure at any scale. There are a number of ways to measure ET indirectly, or in other words, to measure everything but ET and then back calculate for it. These include things you're probably familiar with, like the pan evaporation method, water balance, or energy balance methods. You can also use an equivariance method, which is commonly used in an attempt to measure ET directly. Even estimating ET, though, is from climate data, from weather data, is difficult, as you can probably surmise from the Penn and Monteith equation shown here. Because of this difficulty, there's been dozens of ET estimation methods that have been developed over the years in an attempt to reduce data requirements inherent to the Penn and Monteith equation. Shown here is just a subset of these methods. These were evaluated in a publication in 1990, which remains kind of one of the seminal publications on this topic. As you can see, Penn and Monteith has been continually shown to perform fairly well relative to observed ET across climates, geographies, and timescales. Before we get too far, let me just clarify some terminology. Reference ET is the theoretical ET from a well-watered reference crop, is how it's defined. This is what something like the Penn and Monteith model gives you. Whereas potential ET is equivalent to reference ET in that it assumes, that unlimited water supply, but it's for a real crop or landscape. So to calculate PET, reference ET is multiplied by what is commonly referred to as the crop coefficient curve, which is essentially just a set of time variant correction factors. And finally, actual ET has its upper limit defined by potential ET, but is limited by what are essentially a set of resistances representing things like soil water limitation and stunted crop growth. So the first thing we did in this research was compare the estimates from 8 different ET models. So Penman-Monteith was actually used as the method against which the others were compared, given that it's been repeatedly shown over the years to be quite robust. The goal here was to determine if there are less, other less data-intensive models that might be usable in the upper Midwest here. Here's a quick look at the different input requirements of these methods. As you can see, it varies quite a bit, with Penman-Monteith on the top here requiring the most input data, requiring things like temperature, wind speed, net radiation, dew point, and elevation, and Thornthwaite on the bottom, and one of the modifications of Thornthwaite just require temperature and latitude. So before we got into any actual water balance modeling, we first just simply computed reference ET at 5 locations in the Midwest. You can see here Wahpeton, North Dakota, Brunswick, Nebraska, Waseca, Minnesota, Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and Champaign, Illinois. The reason we chose these locations is partly because they all had reasonably good weather data available for an overlapping period of time, and partly these locations basically span the climate of the Midwest, of the upper Midwest, as you can see here from this map of average annual precipitation between 1981 and 2010. And this is taken from the PRISM dataset. So there are a lot of ways to visualize and examine these results. Here's one way. On the x-axis is shown Penman-Monteith, and on the y-axis is each of the other methods that were being compared with Penman-Monteith. There's a lot of things that I could point out here, far more than I probably have time to today. So if you're really interested, I'll refer you back to my thesis. But just a quick scan of these plots should tell you that some of these methods performed a lot better than others relative to Penman-Monteith, and that the top center plot, which is Doornbos-Pruitt, was closest at most locations. That shouldn't be surprising because it has relatively high data requirements as well. Taking a little bit more of a statistical approach, we can see on an average annual basis which methods performed best relative to Penman-Monteith according to the Nash-Sutcliffe efficiency. So what I'm highlighting here is the top performing method at each location, followed by the second and third in red and black. And the thing to note here is that these, some of these methods perform consistently well, but there is some location dependency indicated here. Notably, Champaign is kind of the oddball when it comes to the performance of the Doornbos-Pruitt method. So I think most of you know a little bit about drain mod, as it's obviously been talked about considerably at this forum, and it's been around for a long time. So the key thing to remember here is that drain mod does not include a crop growth module. The implications of that, I hope, will be clear in a minute. Drain mod has 2 options for calculating ET. You can either supply it as an input, or you can let the model compute it using the Thornthwaite method from daily temperature data. In either case, it uses these ET estimates as potential ET and uses soil water availability and the maximum effective rooting depth parameter to estimate actual ET. The key limitation here is that the lack of a crop growth module means that the ET time series you provide is static, and that the maximum effective rooting depth does not react to delayed or stunted crop growth resulting from something like poor drainage. So to limit the amount of data crunching and quality control that we had to do, we defined the study area sort of as the approximate extent of corn, soybean agriculture in the upper Midwest, as you can see here by this kind of dashed line. And then we actually generated climate data across the study area, simply because we didn't have enough density of real observed climate data to do this kind of meaningful analysis at a large scale. So we used CliGen for this, and converted it to continuous data sets through a geostatistical process called kriging that you might be familiar with. Now we come to the trickiest part in my mind, which is coming up with a crop coefficient curve for any location within that study area. So there aren't crop coefficient curves that have been developed broadly. There's just a few that have been, some research that's been done in the past in places like Idaho and North Dakota. But broadly speaking, it's difficult to track down a good curve for your location. So you can see, though, how important this, how much this can vary over the growing season. So how important this is. You can't just throw reference ET into drain mod. You really do have to correct that potential ET for the for that reference ET, excuse me, for the crop that's being grown. So I won't go into all the details here. Like I mentioned, there's some studies that have been done. These two studies were done in southeastern North Dakota, the Steele and Stegman studies, trying to basically convert field data into a crop coefficient curve. And so I used those studies along with some data on planting and harvest dates to create curves that varied by location. I did this for both corn and soybeans. Here's an example of some of the data I used showing the average soybean planting and harvesting windows across the Midwestern states. And then here's the same thing shown for corn. So part of the challenge here is that, as you can see, there's not really a single date that describes the planting or harvest date, as obviously these states are large and weather varies from year to year, and all kinds of variables are involved there. But this was really the best data I had to work with at such a large scale, and it was at least consistent in the way it was collected. So if we then assume that these data are relatively reliable, and the sort of median date is something that we can use, we can again do some geostatistics by fixing those dates to like the centroid of the corn soybean agricultural area within each state. And we can come up with a rough map of average planting dates shown here, and then average harvest dates. And then again, this is for both corn and soybeans, so two different sets of data. Now we can basically use these dates as anchor points to stretch out our crop coefficient curve from that research that was done in southeastern North Dakota, and create a unique curve at any location in the study area. Clearly, there's a lot of uncertainty in this approach, but at least it gave us something to work with that was consistent across the study area and based in reality, at least to the extent possible. So we performed three simulations, three scenarios in the end with DrainMod. The first was this Penman-Monteith reference ET, so basically supplying the reference ET directly to DrainMod. The second was using our best estimate of potential ET, correcting using those crop coefficient curves. And then finally using the Thornthwaite method directly in the model. So the first comparison really allows us to assess the impact. If we compare scenarios 1 and 2, we can assess the impact of neglecting to correct for those cropping practices. In other words, by just using reference ET instead of potential ET. The second comparison, comparing methods scenarios 2 and 3, then allowed us to assess the impact of using that much simpler Thornthwaite method, which has much lower data requirements, instead of using the Penman-Monteith method. Shown here is the difference between DrainMod's actual ET estimates, which may be kind of nice to look at, but it's not all that easy to interpret. I want you to take note of the different scales that are used here. So I've shown it this way so you can actually see the spatial variation in the results, but it is a bit misleading given that the scale on the left plot is much larger in magnitude than the one on the right. I'm going to show these same results, but as a ratio. This I think is a little easier to interpret. So you can see on the left here, the ratio between the uncorrected and the corrected scenario. Again, reference ET versus our estimate of potential ET, something between 8% and 46% higher if you use reference ET. And on the right, it's a lot smaller, the difference between those two scenarios. If we look at drainage instead of ET, kind of a similar thing. You can see that I've exaggerated the scales here just to show that spatial variation. But if we switch over to the ratio, Now you can see that there's quite a big difference here. If you use reference ET directly in DrainMod, instead of using that potential ET estimate, you can basically double your drainage, or halve your drainage rather. So if we were to revisit a drainage study that was performed, in this case at the Waseca drainage plots in the run-up to 2010 or so, we could see some potential for big changes to these results just by modifying those ET inputs. Now, I should note that this was a calibrated model. It was calibrated to monthly drainage volumes, and I did not go through and recalibrate it as part of this. So this obviously doesn't tell the whole story, but it does raise some interesting questions. So one such question is, how might this impact water quality predictions in DrainMod, since DrainMod does have that water quality component to it, or in other models for that matter, right, other than DrainMod. Another question is, assuming our ET estimate is somewhat accurate, if we were to go ahead and recalibrate this model now, where do we reapportion that excess drainage volume that we're seeing? For example, does this potentially indicate that our vertical seepage rates might be a lot higher than we think? There's a lot of other interesting questions that can be asked in future research that can't really be answered by looking at this. So some of the key findings here, there really isn't one method that can replace Penman-Monteith universally. That's kind of been borne out in the literature over the years. It's just it's the most robust method you can use to estimate ET. Some of them may work pretty well on an annual basis. Doornbos worked pretty well across this whole study area, across the upper Midwest. Hargreaves and Priestley-Taylor tend to work okay in humid areas, and the Hargreaves-Samani and Thornthwaite-Pereira methods tend to work okay in arid areas. But none of them were really sufficient on a monthly basis, and I didn't really show the monthly results here. But there was considerable variability too when you start drilling down temporally. So if using Penman-Monteith is not an option, if you just don't have the weather data to support calculating Penman-Monteith at your location, the best option is actually to try to just estimate some of the missing weather parameters. From the research that I did, that actually will end up getting you a better result than trying to use an alternative method in a lot of cases. But if you do choose an alternative method, the ones with higher data requirements generally perform better. And then paying attention to where that method was developed turns out to be very important. So if it was developed in a humid area, you don't want to apply it in an arid area and vice versa. One of the other things that I noted was that of all the states that I got weather data for, Minnesota was the hardest to find good quality weather data. So that's something that someone at the state could work on. Some of the other findings include that applying the Penman-Monteith correctly is actually very difficult, as many of you probably already know if you've done this before. It does have high data requirements. And I think the key thing here is that crop coefficient curve uncertainty. A lot of times that curve is sort of thrown out there almost as an afterthought, or it's, literature values are used, the FAO values from the Kimberly, Idaho are used. And those just don't really apply across across many areas, I guess. And the last thing is, depending on how you're calculating Penman-Monteith, I have found numerous cases of just user error in the parameterization, in the calculation of that, simply because it is such a complicated equation. DrainMod is very sensitive, as we found, to these potential ET inputs. So accuracy is pretty essential there. We saw up to a 46% difference in predicted ET and up to 100% difference in predicted drainage, where some locations didn't predict any drainage at all if we supplied the reference ET instead of the potential ET. Accuracy there is a bit of a pipe dream right now, because crop coefficients still, I don't have a good way to come up with a crop coefficient curve for you. So that's something that we could work on as researchers, I think. And lastly, the temporal scale really does matter. So for example, the Thornthwaite method in DrainMod, that could probably work pretty well across a lot of the upper Midwest, at least for long-term research. So on an average annual basis over 20 years. But if you're looking at something that requires monthly or seasonal predictions, Thornthwaite just doesn't work very well. And many of the others don't either. So that's what I have. I'll turn it back over to the moderators here.
Thank you, Mike. As all of our presenters have seen, you know, it's challenging to boil down so much work into just a few minutes, but everyone's done a great job throughout the day here, so thank you. John is going to help me out with, you know, looking back through the chat here and maybe pulling some questions out. And then we also want to spend some time on our survey as well and take a look at those results. And as I kind of page back through the chat, I know there were initially some questions for Stephen. Jane was asking if you can describe the lysimeters a bit more.
Yeah, for sure. And so I guess we use two different kinds. The resin lysimeters are essentially small lengths of PVC pipe that are literally just filled with ion exchange resin, both cation and anion, right? So they in principle, they trap the ions that are flowing through that matrix over a defined period of time. And so there's been a number of research groups that have used these. I think you know, I wouldn't necessarily hang my hat on absolute accuracy, right? You're definitely, there is, you know, a change to the soil environment associated with their installation, but I think they're a nice relative measure of nutrient yields.
Daniel asked, were the fields you tested, were they tilled?
Yeah, so we specifically chose, you know, sort of business as usual management. So relatively intensive tillage, typically more moldboard plow after corn, typical N rates, and we selected fields where there wasn't, you know, the subfield scale management. Essentially, the depressions were being managed as similarly as the uplands were.
Great. I want to, you know, skip around here a bit. Yeah, there were a couple questions for Eileen, and Eileen has posted responses to a couple of those, including, you know, a link or two with where to get some of her graphs and so forth. So thank you, Eileen, for that. Allison has also posted some citations there as well. John, are you seeing anything else here that we can pull out for our afternoon presenters?
There was another one from for Stephen. Lost it now.
Oh, was there one about N2O, I think?
Yes. Yep.
So that's a really interesting can of worms. So I don't. But essentially, some years, the drier years, the depressions had tremendous N2O fluxes. Wetter years, suppressed fluxes. We think that it was mostly complete denitrification, or the N2O was actually getting flushed into the tiles and probably emerging downstream. And so we're doing some additional work in that area. But yeah, so where the N2O is coming from in the landscape really seems to be sensitive to the individual weather year.
John or any of my co-hosts, are you seeing anything else we can pull out here?
So Asan asked for Mike Talbot. And Mike Talbot responded with a thesis link, so we're good there.
Did we get the one where about any thoughts for Stephen on why some depressions had increased nutrient leaching while others did not?
Yeah, Matt found the hard question. So, as you know,
Iowa Stater as well, I think.
What's that? I
said, I think from a former Iowa Stater. So
yeah. And so that's what, you know, just in terms of the inundation data I showed you from Amy Kalita's group, like each of these depressions is really fairly unique. And we thought, well, we'll sort of survey a spectrum of representative depressions, and their hydrology is so different, and you can't seem to predict what the geomorphology and how, how that interacts with the sort of idiosyncratic drainage in each individual depression, right? So I think it's difficult. I think we can make some progress in terms of soil characteristics. It does. Thankfully, these are, similar kinds of soils throughout all of these depressions, Clarion, Nicollet, Webster, Okoboji, and so that isn't changing. But what is changing a little bit is the extent to which the organic matter differs in and out of the depression. So I think normalizing there, that can start to explain some of these differences where we have greater contrasts in terms of initial organic matter and texture. That does somewhat explain where we see the biggest differences between the depressions and the upland. But we have a lot more data in the pipeline that can actually help parse this out, I think, in coming months.
Thanks, Stephen. David, I'm not sure what your question is. Would you like to just ask it? Wetland class, seasonal versus semi-permanent? Oh, wetland class. Yeah, is that for Stephen?
Yeah, that was for Steve. He was talking about differences in different wetland basins. I'm wondering if he just looked at the wetland class, like seasonal versus semi-permanent. They treat nitrogen differently.
So these are not really even probably jurisdictional wetlands. I mean, these are, most of these are just that probably don't meet the threshold in Swamp Buster. Is that what you're referring to? I mean, so none of these. I mean, yeah. I think, and that's a strange thing. What to even call these features, right? Are they really wetlands? Well, maybe. I mean, they have some of the soil morphology that we would expect of wetlands. A lot of that is a legacy of the former condition. I don't know.
You don't think that they were classified as a wetland before they got tile drained?
Oh, absolutely they were. But I guess, I mean, so they were, I mean, these were, drained 100 years ago. I guess I'm not sure.
Okay, thanks. And then there's a comment here from Anal about the DrainMod DSAT version that was developed in 2012 that does integrate, DrainMod with crop models. So thanks for that reference. And John had a post too about improved ET estimations. So this is great. A lot of good conversation here and interaction. I guess let's take a minute to, if there are any questions for any of our speakers today before we move on to the survey. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question of any of our speakers or post something in the chat.
Gary, I got a question for Ihsan. This is Tish Gupta. Say, Ihsan, my question about previous soil moisture in your the polynomial model where you had 4 variables. Did you consider that previous soil moisture or maybe the previous year's precept as one of the variables?
Good question, Satish. So this goes back to DrainMod's simulation. So to do the DrainMod simulation, we have daily weather data, temperature, and we actually use the thorn weight, like Michael was mentioning, for the ET. So DrainMod takes daily information, and then it uses, so if you give it a planting date, it's going to use the previous rainfall pattern before that planting date to see if it's time to plant. You can give it your target planting date, but it's going to find the actual planting date based on the soil moisture. So it does include what you're saying. So it takes the whole year into account, not just like the planting date and after. It takes even the non-growing season into account so that it can decide and calculate when to plant. And then that's when the growing season starts in our DrainMod. So all of the data comes into play in an empirical equation. So for the empirical equation that you're asking, probably, I think that's your question, we did not use that. No, we did not use moisture as one of the predictors of the design drainage rate. Different reasons. One, the practicality of it. We wanted to have some predictors that were meaningful and actually practically possible for, I mean, if I come up with one of those as moisture, I mean, it's hard to come up with a moisture to plug into the predictors to actually use it in practice. So the project was very practically oriented.
Yeah, but you can use previous year's precept. You know, sometimes at least in the recent year, that we are getting more precept in the fall, and that is still staying in the soil, that is being carried to the next year. So you can still use previous year's precept as a part of the predictor in the regression equation and see if that's a significant variable or not.
That's a good comment. Thank you. We will think about that, see how we can include that. I understand what you are saying. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ishtan.
Thank you, Satish.
Isan, I'd like to ask a question about using the KSAT values from NRCS in your prediction. It's been our experience that that's one of the hardest things to estimate in the field. I mean, to get a field affected K is very, very difficult. Is there any other methods that you think of that we could use to do that? I mean, other than having actual drainage outflow rates and back calculating it from the water table depths?
So other than the one that you just mentioned, if you have flow, you can back calculate KC from Huchad. Other than that, you're right. And we know that that's one of the most difficult parameters to come up with, and it's highly variable from one location to another. So it's spatially, it varies. So the tool takes in so the database comes from Surgo. So we take those and we have these weighted averages for each location from the surface to the restrictive layer. So every parcel, I forgot the dimension in meters, every several meters by several meters, one parcel or pixel has its property of depth restrictive layer and K. But because, like you're saying, because this is, Surgo obviously wasn't really intended for the way I'm using it with the site specific. I mean, I have heard NRCS tell us that, you know, it's for more general, but we're using it. So to overcome the issue that in some location, the K may be inaccurate in some spots, we have this option in the tool that you can actually enter a value that you have measured and you are more confident in compared to the one that Surgo is automatically providing in the tool. So in the advanced inputs, you enter that value because you happen to measure that with an auger hole method or some other method. But if you know any simple, easier method of this, I mean, soil scientists and engineers have been dealing with KSAT for so long, and it's very difficult. We tried here in Michigan several times, and the water table we kept digging, and then we couldn't find the water table. So you have to go there after it rains. I saw videos of Wayne doing it in a course. It was very interesting, but we just can't really find that water table.
It's very difficult. And I think probably the simplest method, if we could get it done, it would take time, is to just have a drain line where we can measure the flow and keep up with the water table and do the back calculation, because that's going to be more representative of what is at field scale than even doing auger hole tests.
That's a really good method. So for the research, we are doing that method, because for the research, we have the ability to put this observation well between laterals in the field. For this kind of application that you randomly, some person, landowner wants to use it, it's just not really possible to build that in. But for research, we are using what you mentioned, that we are back calculating based on knowing the flow and water level midway and to get the actual proper K. But as a simple, really, really easy, simple way, I don't think there's any simple way.
I would be interested in looking at a sensitivity analysis with your procedure on how far off you could be with that conductivity, what it would do on the overall spacing to select.
We have the capability, we probably have the ability to do that because, as you remember, we have a lot of combination of scenarios. You remember we had 3 drain depths and so on, and a lot of soil. So we have a huge database, and that we can actually do a sensitivity analysis based on that, because based on each soil, we had 5 soils, the K varies. So we can actually do something with that as a preliminary analysis. But good suggestion, Chad. Thanks.
Comments?
Gary, I got somebody mentioned about ClyGen. And
Mike.
I have not used the ClyGen in recent years, but I am not sure the database they used in the ClyGen. And in recent years, we have been getting a lot more rainfall than the original database that they had used to develop the coefficients. So I think one of the things that we may want to look into as a researcher is the ClyGen fairly well up to date in terms of recent climate change that we are getting, at least in the upper Midwest.
Good comment. Do you have a comment on that, Mike?
I mean, that's definitely a discussion point that I wrote about. Yeah, it wasn't certainly wasn't my first choice to use ClyGen, but that's kind of how it ended up shaking out. There are some other options, but nothing was very accessible and easy to implement at that scale at so many locations.
We may want to look into it, whether the coefficients that they have, does the database includes the recent climate that we have been getting?
No, that database is certainly out of date.
If I may comment, now that the word climate change came up, so we did this comparison in our work, and we had weather data from 1951 to 2000. So remember, 1951 to 2000, and then we for this recent work that we did, we used 1990 to 2019. So you see that that's a lot more recent weather condition that we use now. And when we were looking at our optimum drain spacing based on that weather, make a guess. Are we getting closer? Do we need narrower spacings in the recent times, the one that ended 2019 or the one that started 1951? That's probably an easy guess. So the recent period was showing us we need the narrower spacing because of we actually look at the weather changes in the Midwest, and we were getting more precipitation in this recent period, and we noticed that we're getting narrower because we compared it to Wayne Skaggs's publication that he used, the one from 1951, and we saw, wow, it's very interesting, but we really don't know how far it's going to go. I mean, we can't just say, okay, in the year 2040, you're going to continue linearly going narrower, but probably that's not going to be the case because there's more to it than just these two. We just took one snapshot in time, and I think there's more research in terms of the climate and that drainage design that needs to be done for the future. Our tool uses historical data from 1990 to 2019. The climate part is something that I think maybe we can do in the future based on some of the climate data that's available to predict some spacing based on some 40 years in the future.
But you know, the ClyGen, it includes the 1930s data, and that was really the drought years. We have not had it for the last 40, 50 years, that kind of precept. So I think we got to update our models and the databases. We keep on making these projections, and they don't match with the real data. And I think we're putting too much emphasis on the models. We got to start collecting some real world data and see what's going on.
That's why it was great to see John's note about the mesonet in South Dakota, North Dakota, other states there.
Yeah, and Satish, I'll also say there is kind of some behind the scenes work going on to put better weather stations at all of the research and outreach centers. So that's, that's developing slowly, but, and that's something that a bunch of us are pushing for.
Yeah, no, I understand, Lindsay. I think that's a great idea, but some of our recent work that we looked at the river flows, and we are finding that we are getting more river flow because of the climate change. And I think some of these databases, ClyGen, and there was used to be another one, weather generator, they are based on the old databases, and we just got to update them. I think that's what basically I'm saying.
Can't argue there.
So, Gary, can I ask a question if Alec is still on about kind of which practice he might have been referring to there about, about the little farmer adoption, that there might have been more adoption 10 years ago than there is.
Yeah, well, what I'm worried about is that we're spending too much time sort of refilling the ice bucket on the Titanic. We clearly know directionally which way we need to go. We're refining the specifics of what we're doing in very important ways. I track NRCS expenditures on drainage water management, and they're declining. And I don't think we have any good idea of what the adoption is at farmer level, except through tracking NRCS spending. I don't think anybody tracks farmer spending. And so what I think, we're all propeller heads. I appreciate that. We all live in a universe where we, compete with our peers and collaborate with our peers to share information. But what really worries me is ain't nothing really changing out there on the ground. And if we don't shift to focusing on that, we're wasting our time. And I think we're on the verge of it. I think, some of Chad's work on automation, that's going to make a huge difference. I think some of the discussions we had today that looked at farm profitability associated with this stuff, that's going to make a huge difference. I know Jane's put a huge amount of work into thinking about, how do we build resilience into ag systems and et cetera. So, I think everybody's on that, but we've got to get more of that social science focus of, we don't need to just know what to do. We got to know how to get it done.
Yep. I would agree on that, the social science and, what are the barriers to adoption? They aren't always economical. There are other reasons why people do practices, and how do we bring that to bear as we try to get people to make changes? Because I think you're right. I mean, we know directionally where to go, but we have to increase the rate of adoption dramatically to reach some of these goals. And that might be a reasonable time to transition, because as we look at the survey that about 100 people filled out here today, the top topic was water quality. So hopefully we'll see if we can.
Yeah, well, we've got a huge opportunity. We've got a change in administrations. I'm talking to Bonnie about making drainage water management part of what they're changing. We know that some state cons love this stuff, some don't. State cons are the single biggest variable that I know of on how fast things get adopted by the state. But farmers are smart. They've got a really sharp pencil, and they ask the question, does this help me stay in business? And I think we've got to directly confront that answer. Because if we don't address any of those other issues.
What about, this is Satish again, what about if I say that it's going to cost a lot of money and they can't afford it? Then what would you say?
Well, with the NRCS programs, it covers what, 80% of most of these practices. Some states, for example, I knew very little about the Maryland cost share programs until really listening to Tim Rosen, who educated me about them. This stuff covers a huge part out of the public domain, but we don't have good data yet on what the on-farm benefits are of these practices. Does it, we're starting to get it. We're starting to get what are the yield effects. We're starting to ask the questions, what are the input variables that can be saved? Can we save money on insurance? Can we save money on better loan rates? There are lots of other questions like that we need to start to just, not say, how do we tweak that chemical number, but how do we move to adoption? Because if we don't move to adoption, I don't know what we're doing.
No, but you got to look at it. There's another component too, which is the water quality. So if it improves water quality and it costs a lot of money, then what will be your answer?
Yeah, well, I got into this whole stuff because of water quality. And, frankly, if it's water quality in the Gulf of Mexico and my farm's in Iowa, why do I care? If somebody pays me, I care. If I can make money. I think farmers take stewardship very seriously. I'm not in any way degrading farmers. I think that stewardship is a part of their DNA.
Well, most of these is that we have a range of practices as well. So, drainage water management or controlled drainage is one that may work in certain areas, but may not work as well on more sloping fields. We talked about bioreactors today, which I think is, has great potential in saturated buffers and wetlands, and then into cover crops and the 4Rs. So I think there's a range of practices, and some of those cost more money than others. I would argue that 4Rs probably are the least costly, and everybody should be doing those, and we still don't. And some of those may make more money, especially if we think about rate a little bit, and we still need to get adoption of those. So some of these are not just about money; it's about how do we break down the barriers to get people to change from what maybe they have been doing for a generation.
Yeah, Matt, I think you put it exactly. There are a whole series of barriers. Part of it is, hell, I wrote Swamp Buster. I didn't even know what a drainage tile was until about 15 years ago. I put into law that we put the buffers around fields. I had no idea that ditches and tile lines ran right through those. And, so, all of us have blind spots that we don't know about. And, farmers have a lot they're trying to juggle. Oh my God, how many decisions those people have to make about highly technical stuff amazes me. So part of it's farmer education. Part of it is support from NRCS. But I think a big part of it is also, we've got to document the on-farm benefits. So there are multiple barriers. You're exactly right, Matt.
So this was where the the quick question, the quick multiple choice question came out, that water quality was the highest topic. I think, the one Satish brought up about that climate variability and the impact on, water quality, and then also drainage needs was also, I guess, the second highest. So you can see this, and then I don't know if folks are interested to slowly scroll through and see some of the comments, but we can certainly do that.
And can we share this with everyone too, Matt?
I am certainly, yes. If
it's anonymous, right? So
interested, I'll have actually a usage report of everybody that was on here, not just the registered, but actually that are on this meeting. So we could send this out if folks are interested. Yeah, absolutely. I will. I don't think there's anything in here that's we would have to worry about, like an IRB approval or anything like that. We've collected no personal information, right? So.
You see that drainage design, the one that I presented, is the least important one.
No, other, Hassan. Yeah,
No,
but
I don't consider other.
okay.
Other is, there's no name on other, but that one has a name. It says drainage design.
The one
I mean,
thing is though that we can think about there is that, you know, the climate variability impacts on drainage needs that may play into drainage design toward the future.
And
Yeah.
oh, go ahead, Chris.
I was going to say that some of the comments hit on that you know, they could only choose one, and water quality really relates to or is impacted by most of these other ones as well. And so, you know, I think that's certainly true for drainage design. Drainage design has an impact on water quality, and so you know, doesn't mean that drainage design isn't important. I think that you know, water quality just got a lot of votes, but there's so many other ones that agree or that go along with water quality that they're all interrelated in many ways.
Yeah, hi, this is Fabian Fernandez. I also selected that one of climate variability impact on drainage needs on water quality, because it kind of encompasses, I think, where we are right now. It's not just water quality, but it is all the aspects that influence that, whether it's the what we can do through management with drainage or other management, and then the climate variable.
So before I forget, and Jane, I'm frustrated because you should have brought that up like right at 1 o'clock. See, I forgot that. But if people are interested in continued discussions on these drainage and water quality issues, sign up for the Conservation Drainage Network email list. And so the link is there in the chat box now. So sorry, didn't mean to cut off discussion, but before, in case people didn't see that in the chat box, wanted to make sure we brought it up. And I did cut off conversation.
One thing this is Les Everett. One thing I've noticed in southern Iowa, where I have a farm, is that some of the watershed projects are promoting conservation drainage type, or let's say nitrate removal practices, an area which just has advantageous drainage. In other words, they're draining a few wet spots, but I haven't seen any data that indicates that there's much nitrate coming from those places. And I'm wondering if sometime we can have a look at some of these other areas rather than only the heavily drained till locations.
It's harder and harder to find those spots, Les.
And that is one thing that we'll look at in South Dakota. South Dakota is not the same as everywhere else, but that's relatively common in South Dakota, and only 3% of the cropland is tiled in South Dakota. So we're kind of seeing a lot of that, targeted tiling as well as some pattern tiling. But again, there's so many variables that affect nutrient loss, nutrient loads, but that is one variable that we'll look at as well.
Yes, I was wondering how much NRCS was spending in areas that might not, that it could refocus toward the areas with heavier nitrate losses.
Well, Matt, what besides the survey result here, is there anything else we'll be able to provide? There were a couple questions about the presentations. I don't know if
we will work to get those, as long as I did give a caveat to someone that as long as the recordings worked, we will have the recordings of these, and we would work to try to get those posted on the Iowa Nutrient Research Center website. I know there were some questions about the slides, and I would get in touch with, I will get in touch with speakers to see if they have a slide set they're willing to post, but I think most had indicated that they will.
Just going to say, to follow up on Les's comment, that's one thing that we've really wanted to change or move away from in South Dakota is random acts of conservation. and get toward more targeted implementation. But to do that, yeah, it takes knowing what we're working with. And so that's kind of what prompted our project that we're working on in South Dakota.
I'll put a little plug in as well. I'm not sure Emily's still on, but Emily Zimmerman, among others at Iowa State and ARS and other universities, been working a lot on the agricultural conservation planning framework that would, kind of be able to identify locations in watersheds where maybe these practices are best suited to think about, where we might be able to get the greatest bang for the buck in some of these areas. And they're trying to add some kind of nutrient reduction and financial assessment tools as part of that.
To follow up on John's comment, he mentioned the targeted implementation of these practices. The CIG that we were awarded to work with saturated buffer is actually has that goal. So we're trying to help with the on-farm siting and targeted locations, find where it's best to have a saturated buffer, and also optimize the design through that drain mod and that framework of modeling. And also back to Alex's comment about, how can we increase these adoptions? He mentioned rightly, there's education, and NRCS comes in with helping support some of the funding. And also there's research. There was this research publication from Ohio that showed that was writing from a survey that they found is that some farmers or landowners, they don't know how well it's going to work on their farm. We can go all day, talk about how controlled drainage can do range from so many percentage to so many percentage of nitrogen lot, but what is it on that farm? So one of the things that we're trying to do with our CIG is to actually, similar to the one that I showed you with that GIS interface, that we want to run drain mod and run our models and then come up with an estimate of how well it's going to work based on that topography and that soil and that cropping system and so on. So because then we know this many nitrogen pounds average, 30-year average, so many pounds of nitrogen removal, then that can be the foundation of the next step, which is that nutrient trading program that someone is willing to invest and pay for that benefit that someone upstream is providing.
Hopefully Jane is still on. Jane, there was a point about signing up for the Conservation Drainage Network email list. They got a warning message about an unsecured connection and an outdated security configuration. So could just be the computer or the internet. One thing is we did say we'd start on time and we'd be done about 3, and so it's 3, but one thing is it's easier to get home from the meeting this year. I remember last year we rushed through getting the drainage forum done in Brookings because there was a snowstorm on the way, and I remember a little bit of white knuckling in a 15-passenger Iowa State van on the way back to Ames. In fact, we had to skip our planned dinner that we were planning to stop for in Lamar's, Iowa, and so that's one thing that we all have a shorter distance, and also the day is nicer, right, John?
It's a beautiful sunshiny day here in Brookings, South Dakota.
See, we were before Thanksgiving last year. We just needed to be after Thanksgiving. Yeah.
That's right. No, those November snowstorms, they'll get you.
Where are we scheduled to be next year?
I think it would be Minnesota.
Would it be Minnesota?
Yeah. Yeah.
I thought we talked about coming back to Iowa since we weren't in Iowa this year.
Yes, that's what I was just going to say. Unless, if we want to say where the in-person, we can do it in Iowa. And I think Chris and I are willing to host that.
We want to see that beautiful rainbow in Minnesota.
Does anyone have any announcements for the group at all?
I'll maybe put in one more plug for Jane for the Conservation Drainage Network that, this one we tend to keep pretty research focused and we've tried to keep it that way over time. And so, there was a lot of comments about policy and implementation and some of those things. And certainly those are critically important. And Conservation Drainage Network brings together kind of an umbrella of all the different people working on drainage. So we get more of the agency folks and the industry and others that are working on policy and implementation. So it is a chance for a little more holistic conversation around drainage than kind of the research focus that we have on this one. So certainly, if that's something you're interested in, check out the Conservation Drainage Network.
And I guess I would also, this is a long ways out, but hopefully in about September of 2022, right? Yeah, we would be holding an international drainage symposium in Des Moines, kind of follow on to what Gary and Jane organized in St. Paul in, was it 2016? We had planned on doing that in 2021, but with the pandemic, we moved it back a year. And so that is the hope to do it then. And so that would be, hopefully an opportunity for all of those folks on here to travel to Iowa and we'll hopefully also have some field tours to see some of the things going on the ground here as well. If nothing else, I would certainly thank everybody for participating today. I think at least through the presentations, we averaged over 200 on the Zoom at one time. Certainly appreciate folks hanging in there. I know that a long day of Zoom, we're all kind of have a lot of Zoom fatigue, right? But I think the presenters did a great job of keeping things engaging and interesting, and certainly appreciate all of their time to fit in to fit all the information they did in a 20-minute presentation. That's not too easily done. So from my standpoint, thank you very much.